The back room. It goes without saying that the events in one's life will shape a person into who they are supposed to be at the end of the road, and that through hard work and perseverance you could achieve anything. Well, that describes 20-year-old Edgar Ponce. Hard-working, loyal, trustworthy, and most of all loving. He was any girl's perfect man and anyone's best friend. His one apparent downfall is that he didn't have a mean bone in his body. Suffice to say that it has gotten him into trouble a couple of times being walked on and such, but Edgar always seemed to find the silver lining in things, and that always seemed to comfort him through the rough times. Edgar lived by himself in a 2-bedroom apartment, or so he thought. You see, to Edgar he never really felt alone. In fact, he always felt like something else was in the house, or more specifically in the back room. The empty room of his house. He never knew what it was or why he felt that way, but every time he entered that room his blood would go cold. His body would start to tremble, and if he stayed in that room too long his mind would cause him to hallucinate that he was terrified of that back room. He tried multiple times to have it blessed and exorcised of demons, but nothing ever worked. He eventually gave up and decided that he wouldn't ever go in that back room again, and hopefully that would solve the problem. Things went very well for Edgar for the next month. He didn't go into that room and therefore he never had any problems with whatever was back there. Until one day he came home from doing a little grocery shopping to find that the computer he had in his room had been turned on. Edgar raised an eyebrow and went into his room and shook the mouse, clearing away the screensaver. He then saw the following words typed on the notepad of the computer: "I miss you, we haven't talked in a long time." Edgar was even more confused now than ever. Who had turned his computer on? More importantly, who had he not talked to? He had kept up with all of his friends and made sure that all of them knew where he was. So he shrugged and left the room, figuring it was just something he had forgot about, and left it at that. He ate dinner that night in peace, but toward the end of the meal he heard a noise coming from his room. It sounded like someone was typing on his keyboard. Edgar was thrown off a bit but didn't even consider the possibility it could be something of supernatural proportion. He had forgotten mostly about the back room, and it had become routine to do things without even thinking of entering it. After dinner he got up and went to his room to check on the typing sounds that he heard. He stared at the computer in amazement. His eyes widened and his skin crawled. He could feel goosebumps form on his arms and the hair on his skin stood on end. On the computer, typed out on the notepad, was this sentence in bigger, bolder letters: "I miss you, we haven't talked in a long time." Without thinking he backed up a few steps and glanced toward the back room. He could feel the forgotten chills that he once felt. The memories had come rushing back to him. At that moment a power surge struck the house and all the power went out. The house was black. Apart from the few rays of street lights that shone in, he couldn't see a thing. He felt his heart quicken and his mind began to wander. He could feel himself slowly lose grip on reality. Things all became a blur, and before he knew it, he fell to his knees. His body felt numb as he felt his consciousness slip from him. Edgar had passed out. When he awoke it was the next day. He slowly sat up as his head was still a little tipsy from the night before. He slowly opened his eyes and stood up. He looked around and once again felt the horror of the previous night. He had awakened in the back room. Clutched by fear he dashed out of the house, desperate to be anywhere else but there. Surrounding people began to take notice as Edgar dashed past. He just kept on running, not stopping until he reached a park. It wasn't that far from his house, but it was a nice relaxing park where kids could play and run around. It calmed him on the occasions that days didn't go as he had liked. He caught his breath and closed his eyes, focusing his mind on the events that had happened, trying to figure out if it was all real or not. He then started to think about the messages that had been typed out on his computer, and things slowly started to become clear. Whatever had typed those messages was the same thing that had dragged him into that back room. It was nightfall when he decided to finally head back to the house. He had spent the majority of the day at the park, apart from getting something to eat and occasionally strolling around the perimeter for some exercise. On his way back he was a bit more relaxed, but still somewhat traumatized from awakening in the back room. As he returned to the apartment, he began to feel a very different vibe from it. One he had not ever felt before. It seemed that what he had sensed in the back room had suddenly expanded. He felt like whatever it was had began to explore. He hadn't even entered the apartment yet as he began to get chills. He reluctantly unlocked the door and pushed it open. His legs began to tremble a bit, but he forced some courage out and walked inside. He then closed the door but doesn't lock it in case he needs to get out quickly. His eyes darted around the apartment in search of any type of change that may have occurred on his absence. None could be found upon the first look. He slowly made his way through his home, searching hard for anything out of place. With every step he took, his anticipation grew. He just knew he would find something. He could feel it in his bones. He also knew that when he found it, no matter how much mental preparation he did, it wouldn't matter. He knew that whatever it was would leave him vulnerable as it did the previous night, and more importantly, he knew if that did happen, he was afraid he would once again relive that same fate of passing out and waking up in that back room. He slowly and very shakily turned the corner of his kitchen, now facing directly into the back room. He stared blankly, mouth agape, eyes glazed, body suddenly spaghetti-like at what was standing in the back room doorway. A dark figure with long red hair reaching halfway down his back, red eyes that pierced into his soul, and a smile that chilled his bones to the core. His smile literally stretched from ear to ear. His hands were claw-like and menacing. He stood there staring directly at Edgar. He then said in a dark, deep and demonic voice, "I miss you, we haven't talked in a long time." He then let loose a hideous, evil laugh. Edgar once again fell to the floor. 3 weeks passed and no one heard from Edgar. His friends began to worry, one friend in particular. Denise Rowland, a friend since high school. She and Edgar had once had a crush on each other and would always exchange love notes as though they were little kids. He would always fold the notes in the shape of a heart to further show his affection for her. She decided one day to go and visit Edgar. It wasn't like him to ignore her, and she was concerned that maybe something had happened. She drove over to his apartment complex and parked in one of the available parking spaces. She casually walked up to his place, looking around in the relatively pretty view of the city that surrounded his complex. She knocked on the door and waited. A few minutes passed with no answer, so she tried again, knocking a little louder and calling out to him. Once again, no answer. She decided to try the door. She turned the knob and was surprised to find it unlocked. How strange, she thought. Why would Edgar leave his door unlocked if he wasn't there? She opened it and walked in slowly. She called out his name, but once again no reply. She was much more concerned now. She slowly made her way across the apartment, turned down the hall and saw that the back room door was closed. It was the only closed room in the house, so she figured she would stop in and see if he was back there. She cautiously approached the door, opened it and walked in. She then saw the most astonishing sight of her life. There in the corner of the room, propped up against the wall, was Edgar Ponce's dead body. It was pale, limp and lifeless. Just before she screamed, she noticed that in Edgar's hand was a note folded in the shape of a heart. She hesitantly reached for it and unfolded it and read the message, "I miss you, we haven't talked in a long time." The end.